Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Glad you could be here. We've got lots to tell you about on this week's show. And we are starting things off with markets, and according to the latest crop progress report from the USDA, U.S. corn held steady with 65% of the crop rated good to excellent. Soybeans were up 1 point from the prior week at 60%, with 63% of the crop having reached the blooming phase. Our attention remains focused on the forecast and drought concerns throughout the plains and the Midwest. Elaine Kub joined me this week to discuss how markets are reacting to all of that. And we started off by getting a check on how things are at her farm in South Dakota, where 90% of the state is in some level of drought.
This is the time of year when you really see it in the spring wheat. You know, a lot of my neighbors have already baled up their spring wheat because the yield is just not going to be there. And I suppose it'll be another couple weeks before we get real harvest reports for the spring wheat, but I don't have high hopes for that. And I think that's pretty widespread, not just here in eastern South Dakota, but as you mentioned, up into North Dakota. Minnesota is also dry, and even the Canadian prairies. So all of the North American spring wheat is pretty grim, like you say. And the corn and soybeans, you know, they still look green. They're not firing, they're not dead. So it's just hard to say. It's more of a mystery of just how grim that yield prospect might be.
And you know, Elaine, a lot of times our focus is so much on the main crops like corn and soybeans that we don't think about pulse crops. And I know pulse crops are big in North Dakota, things like dry beans, chickpeas. So what are those producers dealing with right now?
Yeah, that is just terrible when you look at the North Dakota crop progress report. The pasture conditions are 5% good and 0% excellent. But the specialty crops that you mentioned, like the dry edible beans, I think it's something like 13% good to excellent. Maybe sunflowers and the canola is maybe more like 19 or 24% good to excellent. So very poor. But you know, Troy, it's not just in North Dakota where those specialty crops are. There's also some grown in Nebraska, right? So if you were in a situation where you actually had less horrible drought, I mean, I think it is dry in western Nebraska too, but there could be some opportunities for some producers there who actually have the yield to take advantage of some of these marketing problems that are likely to occur this fall when the buyers and the users go out and looking for these specialty crops and they're just not going to be there.
Can you tell us what you're tracking with soybeans as they move into their critical stage? Is it more with weather?
Well, what's really interesting about soybeans is that this critical stage is happening earlier this year. We've had such a fast accumulation of growing degree days all across the country, really. And now we're seeing soybeans, like I think 63% are already blooming, which is 6% percentage points more than usual, maybe about a week faster than usual, which means, you know, and Al Dutcher can fill you in more about the forecast, but my understanding is it's going to be hot and dry for the next couple of weeks, which means this is the time frame when soybeans most need good weather and they're not going to get it. So I think the soybean market itself should likely continue to be quite volatile, which we've seen, of course, over the past month or so. You get wild daily swings. This week, the swings haven't been as wild, but I think it's possible that we'll see more of that in the future when this weather happens right at this critical time frame for blooming soybeans.
And next up, let's talk about corn basis. Can you give us an idea of where it's at in your area and what we could see maybe happen?
Yeah, my particular area happens to be one of these pockets where I think the elevators got caught short, and it's very strong. I mean, it's over $1 basis for old crop corn here in South Dakota, which is unheard of. And there's various other pockets throughout the Corn Belt, even, you know, out east in Ohio, there's some places where you have this basis of more than $1 over. But largely, I think the strongest parts of the old crop corn market probably peaked a couple of weeks ago. The panhandle of Texas, the feedlots there, you're still seeing some of them bidding over $7 for cash corn, but largely through the middle of the Corn Belt, the basis bids are more like 60 over or 80 over, somewhere in that $6.50, $6.80 range. So extremely good prices. I mean, if you were somebody who was aiming for this hot July summer market to sell whatever corn you have left in your bin, now is the time to shoot your shot, right? Like this is the hot opportunity.
And Elaine, you were just talking about selling dates to keep in mind, and we'll often talk about mid-July as a time when folks can get some sales in. Well, here we are almost in August. Are there any upcoming dates that we need to circle on the calendar as ones that we should be aware of when it comes to marketing?
Well, we'll kind of talk about new crop marketing here. And you're right that this is traditionally a pretty good time. I mean, the highest probability of seeing the date of the absolute high of the new crop market is usually in mid-June, because that's when the corn market is facing the most risk, when you have the highest chance of having some kind of a weather market or weather risk premium in the market. This year, I think folks have been pushing back their old crop marketing because we've been so uncertain about even if we're even going to have a crop. And I think some of us up here in the Dakotas are still in great question about whether or how much grain we're even going to have to sell. But if you're somewhere that you've had enough rain that you feel you're going to have enough corn or soybeans to bring to market, yeah, this I think is a good opportunity to lock in some of these new crop prices. I think there are certainly possibility that prices will go higher into harvest if we continue to have this dry weather and more recognition of the lower yields we're likely to have. But I think there's some certainly possibility of seeing lower prices, seasonally lower prices into harvest. So with that sort of 50-50 idea, I think a risk management strategy would be, yes, lock in some of these new crop prices.
Next week, we'll be joined by Chad Hart from Iowa State University. Next up, as Elaine just mentioned, while a majority of corn and soybeans seem to be growing as planned, over the last month, Nebraska producers have seen pockets of disastrous weather. We're currently about midway through the growing season, so Market Journal's Bill Dodd decided it would be a good idea to check in with Nebraska Extension's Jenny Rees to get a mid-season assessment on corn and soybean production and some tips on evaluating severe weather damage.
So far this season, Nebraska's corn and soybean crops are doing well. However, there have been some locations in the Cornhusker State that have seen some weather-related damages. For those who have been impacted by these weather events, it's time to turn their focus toward recovery. Beyond hail damage and wind damage, Extension educator Jenny Rees tells me she's heard additional concerns among several soybean producers.
The past couple weeks, we had quite a few questions regarding soybeans and just how slow they were on growing this year, at least in this part of the state. How slow they were on growing this year, getting canopy closure. And in no-till fields in particular for this part of the state, we noticed the ground was really hard. We didn't have the freeze thaw that we typically have with a winter because we had that deep snow layer. And even though it was cold outside, we didn't get the freeze thaw that we typically get. So that created some things regarding really hard soils. Soybean roots weren't really penetrating those hard soils. We also seen some herbicide carryover with some of our HPPD inhibitors in this part of the state anyway. And we talked about it today at the field day that maybe the freeze thaw also is a factor in why those herbicides didn't break down as much in the soybean fields, in spite of the fact that we had a lot of rain in March. So that was a good thing to think about too. Since the past couple of weeks, we were irrigating soybeans, which we typically don't recommend this early in the season for silt loam soils, but we were doing that to allow those roots to be able to move through that really hard layer in the soil.
In some cases, hail damage doesn't necessarily mean the end to a season. Some producers who endured some earlier hail events have been pleased to notice many corn plants that had been stripped of their leaves are making a comeback. In any case, properly evaluating your crop after a weather event is critical.
Even fairly severely stripped up leaves, we're seeing that new leaves are coming or they're coming out of the whorl and replacing those stripped up leaves. It's looking a lot better 10 days, 14 days post hail. So they should also be looking for bruising on those stalks and where it's occurring. I recommend even using a pocket knife and peeling back those layers and looking at how far that bruising is going into the stem to see if any bacterial rot is setting in. Also, where is the bruising occurring on that stem? Seen probably the worst damaged fields, that bruising has been pretty severe right at the ground level. And so plants in those fields are already just breaking off at the ground, or you barely walk into those fields and barely touch plants and they're breaking off. So those are situations where they, depending on what happens with talking with their crop insurance adjuster and depending on how bad that damage was, would be possible replant situations and considering what they're going to replant in there if those fields are totaled, depending on what herbicides were applied. But it really depends on the level of damage. If it's just stripped up leaves mostly, we don't anticipate a lot of, or really hardly any yield damage to that, and the crop insurance charts wouldn't show that either.
If you do need to file a claim for weather damages with your insurance company, it's paramount that you understand the method being used to estimate the current growth stage. Above all else, as this process can be a lengthy one, it's important to remain patient.
When talking with your crop insurance adjuster, it helps if you've already been out in your field or worked with an agronomist to be out in your field, just to have an idea of where the worst damage areas of your field are. And then ultimately just be patient with them, because they need to wait about 7 to 10 days post-hail damage in order to come out and do the assessments for looking at how much green regrowth is there for that leaf tissue, and also looking at if new buds are coming on the cases of soybeans. We've seen soybeans that are anywhere from defoliated to even just sticks in places. And so those are some things to think about with your crop insurance adjuster, and they may delay you to harvest. And so just working with them, seeing what they're going to do in that.
Another thing to take under consideration when dealing with mid-season hail damage are future input costs. These costs will be largely determined by what inputs have already been or will be applied to your operation.
Regarding inputs, it really depends what inputs have already been put on, and what inputs are anticipated. So the biggest one at this point going forward is nitrogen. And so was most of that nitrogen put on pre-plant or early on in the season, or was the intention to kind of spoon feed it through the season? So that's something that growers can think about regarding an input. But other than that, the other main input is just thinking about the herbicide program, if in the case they need to either replant or are thinking about a cover crop or something for weed control later.
While hail damage in row crops can cause significant yield loss, it can also alter management strategies for the remainder of the season. Therefore, it's important to properly assess any damages as they come. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks, Bill. Jenny also tells us hail tends to open the crop canopy, allowing weeds to germinate. If this problem is detected, it's important the weeds are under control before they reach a height of 4 inches. We've got more information on other post-hail threats on the Market Journal website. And next up, as cattle producers settle into the dog days of summer, several factors continue to influence markets in both the short and long term. Drought and poor pasture conditions are taking their toll, resulting in a larger number of cows being sent to market than in years past. Additionally, higher feed costs are putting pressure on feeder cattle prices. Mike Briggs over at Briggs Feedyard in Seward joined me this week to shed some light on what he's seeing and the big market movers that he's following.
A lot of stuff going on right now. Of course, everybody's always concerned with the current cash market. You know, that's always a question of what's going on. Right now, with a 594 high pressure system sitting in, everybody's focused really hard on the corn price, because that has been extremely volatile this year. I think will continue to be volatile and affects your cost of gain rather dramatically, so guys have to pay attention to that. Then, of course, if you're trying to buy feeder cattle right now, you can't buy a margin to save your life. Well, when can we buy some cattle that make some sense? And wish I knew. Seems kind of difficult right now, and I think it's going to be tough as we go forward, because one of the things that's been going on over the last couple of years is we've started to slaughter more and more cows. Well, as you do that, your pool of feeder cattle gets a little smaller, and I think that's going to come to a head next year.
You've talked before about how a lot of your customer base, if they're making a good profit with corn and the way the prices are right now, then they don't want to give that back to feed the cattle. Are you seeing that right now?
Oh, you're always dealing with that, because when corn's high, the farmer feeder guy, he doesn't want to feed cattle. Sell that corn, go sit in the coffee shop or whatever they do. But that's always a challenge. Conversely, like if feeders are really high, I have talked customers out of feeding their cattle, because I'm like, there's no way you're going to make any money on those. Sell them. Call it good. I just advised somebody that the other day. They've got some cattle on grass, and these feeder cattle are so unbelievably high. Not only do they not have any margin, they have huge negative margins in them. I'm like, why would you want to bring those here? Sell them. Be done with it. And so you're always having those conversations with your customers if you're going to be honest with them. And I always try to be best I can.
And you just mentioned margins. Anything else you want to say on that?
It's just really difficult. Your corn is all over the place, and conversely, so is your distiller's grains or your co-products. And then there's just so much demand for feeder cattle right now. It's really difficult to buy anything that makes any sense. But July is always the hardest time to buy feeder cattle because everybody's looking. Now, when we get later in August, after some of the corporates get their belly full, kind of let the rest of us live a little bit, you're going to see an increasing amount of cattle come to market for various reasons. One, just the time of the year, but also where it's getting drought. Those cattle are coming. That makes me a little concerned as we go forward that we're going to pile up some cattle maybe on the fat. When they get fat, we might have a little bit of them piled up there a little bit, but we'll see what happens.
And Mike, we are recording this interview before the release of the eagerly awaited cattle inventory report at the end of the month. Any expectations on what we could see for when that comes out?
Yeah, the cattle inventory report. People may be surprised how much our cow numbers have fallen, because this drought isn't just the first year. This was kind of starting a little bit last year in places. It's really hard for the rancher right now to make very much money. He's got higher input costs and lower selling. They were lower, but now the feeder cattle prices are coming up. But those guys have been getting squeezed a little bit, and anytime you have to start buying feed for a cow, it's better to send her down the road. So I think you could be surprised at where our cow inventory is, conversely than your total cattle numbers. But I think you're going to see a foreshadowing of what's to come in the future here as we get tighter and tighter numbers.
Anything you're watching with beef demand as we move through the rest of the summer and head into Labor Day?
I am, because eventually, and you're going to see this in the upcoming cattle on feed, our cattle on feed numbers keep dropping. Well, okay, then as you go out, your fat numbers or your cattle for sale or fat cattle for sale is going to drop. And somewhere here, you're going to hit that crossroads where this price really kind of zooms higher. I don't know where that is. There's a lot of people talking about $1.40, $1.50 cattle this winter. But it always concerns me when they do that, especially when we already have a carry in the market. The deferred futures are at a premium to the nearby, because every time we set that up like that, that's just like a carrot on a stick for people to place cattle. They place the cattle and you get there and the carrot's gone. So I really implore guys to be really careful with the risk management, because you've got deferred prices up 135, 138, bumping up against 140. I don't even know the last time we sold cattle that high, probably never. So you got to be a little careful with what they're hanging out in front of you to coax you into feeding cattle.
There's so much going on in the industry right now with the drought and possible herd liquidation. Feed prices always an issue. What's the big story you're going to be following for the second half of 2021?
You know, it's going to be all of it. Yeah, I think you're just going to have to watch when you see demand come back. You know, there's a lot of fears right now because of the Delta variant, and we're going to shut the economy down again. Hopefully that's not the case, because nobody that owns a business or the American public needs to go through that again. But I think right now you're seeing a little bit of a fear where yesterday I had the stock market down 800 points. If we can level that out, then we can start that ball rolling back up again, I think, because this economy's got a long ways to go to recover, and hopefully it can if the government doesn't throw too many roadblocks in there.
Always good getting a chance to visit with Mike. And sticking with cattle, sustainable farming and ranching is becoming a popular topic in Nebraska. During the 2021 Summer Grazing Tour, one of the ranches featured was the Kalkowski Family Ranch. Their focus is on maintaining their grass and rangeland through natural practices. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh has more.
Conserving grasslands for future generations should be the responsibility of all ranchers. Sustainable ranching is exactly what they practice at the Kalkowski Family Ranches near Lynch, Nebraska, and they work to share the word with others.
Well, I think conservation and stewardship is one of our main focuses on our ranch. I think we have an obligation to keep healthy soil, healthy grass, clean water, clean air. With this Biden 30-30 initiative, I think it's becoming more important. I think we in agriculture have a story to tell. And I think we're doing a very good job on our lands, and we need to share that story.
Tim says they use both warm and cool season grasses and are currently conducting studies to diversify their ranges.
We're predominantly cool season grasses, but we are doing a NRCS study where we are trying to influence the growth of warm season grasses. So we do high density grazing early in the season. We hit it very hard and then we let it rest. And we're trying to see if that will encourage more warm season grasses, and we're seeing some success. The reason we would want more warm season grasses is because in diversity in range management is very important. So we're just trying to get that diversity with the cool and warm season grasses.
Another way the Kalkowskis practice sustainable ranching is through the use of prescribed burns. Not only do these burns help the soil, they also keep unwanted growth, such as cedar trees, at bay.
Yeah, we have in this country, the cedar trees are an issue. So we do controlled burns to take care of the cedar trees. But as we showed on the tour, through the burning, I think we're helping our grasslands also, and our soil and our wildlife. So I think there's a lot of benefits to controlled burning.
Lastly, Tim says he is grateful for the summer grazing tour and encourages ranchers to take part so they can learn from current sustainable practices and see firsthand how it works.
No, I just think, we live in a great country. I think the NGLC with their summer tour is a great opportunity to witness conservation and stewardship. A lot of like-minded people that just want to take care of their land and protect the wildlife, protect the soil, protect the water. And I think we're doing a great job. And again, we just need to share that story.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
Thanks, Maddie. Next up, agritourism enterprises are nothing new as an income stream for farmers. But how those agritourism adventures are advertised to potential travelers is changing. Today, social media platforms that list agritourism activities, lodging, and ventures also help in getting the word out to the public about farms and ranches hosting travelers. You can learn more about changes to the agritourism industry in the July issue of Nebraska Farmer. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, if we're talking crops, then talking about the weather has got to be part of the conversation. What can we expect in the week ahead?
Well, Troy, we're now to that point of the game where we're getting into our reproductive period for our warm season crops. As of Monday, corn was basically above the 50% mark in terms of silking. Most of the silking that was left to occur really is over the northwestern one half of the state. We are starting to see some of the initial grain fill into the southeastern part of the state. We are seeing quite much of this crop, of the soybean crop, in the bloom stage, with the initial starting to set pods across portions of southeast and east central Nebraska. As we go forward, of course, we've been talking about this heat building in, and the fortunate thing is at least from the eastern Nebraska standpoint, the last couple of days were actually cooler than originally forecasted. But the heat has started to build into the region from the Panhandle, and we're going to be into this heat pattern for at least the next week. The question is, does it extend longer than that? And that's the big uncertainty going forward. So as we go to the upper air models, the first thing I'll draw your attention to is that we've got this big ridge in place, got a northwest flow over the Great Lakes with the Hudson Bay low, and basically most of the precipitation activity of any consequence is going to ride this channel. Now, the GFS model is showing the development of a surface low over central Kansas, but really it's a moisture-starved system. So most of the moisture that we see in terms of echoes, in terms of precipitation, is coming from the monsoon flow. We might get an isolated thunderstorm develop in the Panhandle, but overall it looks like a fairly dry process. There is a little wave as we go into tomorrow that's moved down the front side of this ridge that may induce a few isolated thunderstorms, particularly over Iowa and points to the east. You can see that they're trying to hint at an isolated thunderstorm over Nebraska, but most of the moisture is to our southwest. And then that high pressure starts to build in on Monday. That keeps the eastern part of the state a little bit cooler than the western part of the state, so we'll still be in the lower to mid 90s east. We're going to be more in the mid to upper 90s west. Once again, there's that scattered chance of an isolated thunderstorm, primarily across western Nebraska. Now on Tuesday, the ridge starts to really expand. toward the east, and we're going to see temperatures statewide above 95 degrees, and we'll see some isolated 100-degree temperatures probably across the southwest and south central part of the state. Precipitation stays up in the Great Lakes, and of course with a monsoonal flow in the southwest. On Wednesday, that ridge expands eastward, so we're going to see another day of temperatures well up into the 95 and above range. Low pressure rides along the South Dakota-Nebraska border and may generate some isolated thunderstorm activity, particularly across the northern tier of counties. Once again, some spotty monsoonal moisture moves up into the central Rockies. On Thursday, this trough starts to deepen a little bit over the Great Lakes. That's going to shove the ridge back a little bit and give us just a slightly cooler trend across the northeastern one half of the state, probably drop our temperatures about 5 degrees. Low pressure once again forms over central Kansas. Most of the precipitation again stays into the desert southwest. And as you'll notice Friday, again, this ridge gets pushed just a little bit farther to the southwest. Low pressure develops in southwestern Kansas, may actually induce some moisture up into our region, and there is a good chance we'll see some thunderstorm activity somewhere from eastern Nebraska through central Iowa. And then on the backside, we see the monsoon moisture riding all the way from the desert southwest up into the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. So overall, we do have a good, decent shot of precipitation, particularly as we get to the end of next week. The biggest concern going forward is, will this ridge break down? At least from the Climate Prediction Center's forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, they're indicating the core of that high pressure system will be over Nebraska. The latest GFS models I've been seeing really doesn't bring this core heat back until at least 4 or 5 days past this next weekend. In terms of precipitation, most of the major below normal precipitation will be in the southern plains, slightly below normal across the east, but you can see that monsoon moisture starting to make its way into the western part of the state. And this will be an important component, because if this does play out, we may get into a period from the first week of August where we'll deal with scattered thunderstorm activity from the monsoon flow before temperatures start to warm up once again.
Thanks, Al. That's going to do it for this week's show. Next week, UNL's Greg Ibach joins us to discuss his recently published op-ed about reimagining federal conservation programs in the U.S. And Chad Hart joins us for our market segment. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.